Gentleman from Washington.
Mr. Chairman, with that, I ask for the yeas and nays.
Does the gentleman ask for a recorded vote?
I ask for a recorded vote.
Pursuant to Clause 6 of Rule 18, further proceedings on the amendment offered by the gentleman from Ohio will be postponed. What purpose does the gentleman from California seek recognition?
Mr. Chairman, pursuant to H.Res. 260, I offer amendments en bloc.
Clerk will designate the amendments in bloc.
On block number 3, consisting of amendments numbered 29, 50, 51, 52, 55, 56, 57, 58, 59, 60, 61, 63, 65, 66, 68, 71, 75, 80, and 160, printed in House Report number 113-108, offered by Mr. McKeon of California.
Mr. Chairman, I ask unanimous consent that amendment number 29 be modified in the form I have placed at the desk.
The clerk will report the modification.
Modification to amendment number 29, offered by Mr. McKeon of California, page 317, strike lines 15 to 23.
Mr. Chairman, I ask unanimous consent that the reading of the modification be dispensed with.
Is there objection? Without objection, the amendment is modified. Pursuant to House Resolution 260, the gentleman from California, Mr. McKeon, and the gentleman from Washington, Mr. Smith, each will control 10 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentleman from California, Mr. McKeon.
Mr. Chairman, I urge the committee to adopt the amendments en bloc, all of which have been examined by both the majority and the minority. This time I yield 1 minute to my friend and colleague, the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Culberson.
The gentleman from Texas, Mr. Culberson, is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My amendment number 66 on the bill is very straightforward. The Medal of Honor is our nation's highest award, given only to those soldiers who have performed personal acts of valor above and beyond the call of duty. Today, the medal has been made of brass. My amendment today would ensure that from this date forward, the Medal of Honor be made of gold. It's all the least we can do for our bravest soldiers who have earned America's highest award, and I would move passage.
Gentleman yields back. Gentleman from Washington.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield 2 minutes to Mr. Cardenas of California.
The gentleman from California is recognized for 2 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I'd also like to thank Chairman McKeon and Ranking Member Smith for their leadership and bringing this bill to the floor. I also want to thank them for allowing me to speak on my amendments, even though they'll be considered later on today. The 3 amendments that I have offered will strengthen our nation's cybersecurity so we can effectively defend our nation, economy, and innovation. We all know that cyber-based terrorism, espionage, and computer intrusions and fraud are not going away anytime soon. These attacks occur far more frequently and far more rapidly and are more sophisticated than most people would care to know. Anonymity makes it difficult to trace the origin of these attacks and prosecute criminals. These attacks are not only intended to steal defense secrets or technology, but are also targeted at some of our most critical industries. According to the Mandiant study, those industries include construction and manufacturing, media, advertisement, and entertainment, financial services, healthcare, food and agriculture, and education. This is not only a national security, but also an economic issue as well. My First Amendment strengthens our preparedness and ability to fend off attacks by expanding our understanding of the economic impact of cyber intrusions on U.S. defense industry. It also requires the Department of Defense to identify ways to protect our intellectual property when attacks occur. My Second Amendment directs the Secretary of Defense to establish an outreach and education program to educate small businesses on cyber threats and assist them in developing plans to protect intellectual property and their networks. My Third Amendment ensures that the comprehensive mission analysis of cyber operations mandated in this bill also includes an assessment of the retention, recruitment, and management of the cyber workforce. Department of Defense must provide appropriate incentives and opportunities and professional development paths that will encourage civilians and service members to enter and hone into the skills that they need to be part of this cyber field. These amendments will strengthen our national security, and I urge their passage, and I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. The gentleman from California is recognized.
Mr. Chairman, at this time I yield 2 minutes to the gentleman from Indiana for the purpose of a colloquy.
The gentleman from Indiana is recognized.
I thank the distinguished gentleman for yielding. Mr. Speaker, I rise to commend the Armed Services Committee on their excellent work here. And I want to take this opportunity to highlight an issue addressed in last year's NDAA, which required the Secretary of Defense to produce a report this fall that examines an issue of great importance. During my prior service on the Armed Services Committee, I learned of a discrepancy in the law where military facilities closed outside of the BRAC process are not given the same indemnification against liabilities that are a result of hazardous substances left over from any previous DoD activities. Several Army ammunition plants were closed outside of the BRAC process, and because DoD is not required to maintain responsibility for potential problems related to military use, we're hindering redevelopment of these properties. Last year, I wrote a bill called the Base Redevelopment and Indemnification Correction Act, or the BRIC Act, that would extend the same BRAC protections to non-BRAC closed facilities. It was included in the House-passed NDAA, but was removed during conference. However, language was adopted that requires a DoD assessment of the status of these former defense facilities, as well as recommendations to facilitate their redevelopment. Local redevelopers should not be held responsible for any lingering issues that were a result of DoD operations. I anticipate the Secretary's report on this matter will provide a path forward for these former military installations that remain disadvantaged without these important indemnification protections. I thank the Chairman for his continued support to address this ongoing issue and look forward to working with the committee after the report's release to address this glaring anomaly. I yield to the gentleman.
I thank the gentleman. Reuse of former military installations is essential for the local communities and in many circumstances represents a real opportunity to amortize the initial costs of a new development. I also look forward to receiving a copy of the Secretary's report, and I hope it will inform Congress so that we may address this important issue in a deliberate and thoughtful manner. I especially look forward to hearing the Secretary's recommendations in dealing with this important matter. I reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman reserves. The gentleman from Washington is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I yield 1 minute to Mr. Takano of California.
The gentleman from California is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thanks to the gentleman from Washington for yielding. Mr. Speaker, I rise today to express my strong support for the amendment submitted by the gentleman from Maryland, Mr. Cummings, known previously as H.R. 1842, the Military Family Home Protection Act. As a member of the Veterans Affairs Committee and the ranking member of the Economic Opportunity Subcommittee, taking care of our service members and their families is one of my top priorities. This legislation does just that. It takes care of our heroes. By staying foreclosures when service members are receiving hostile fire or when they are medically discharged, by doubling the civil penalties for mortgage-related violations, and by prohibiting banks from discriminating against service members, veterans, or surviving spouses, the Military Family Home Protection Act no longer allows our heroes and their families to be taken advantage of. Since the economic downturn, more than 700 service members have been wrongfully foreclosed on, and more than 1,500 service members have been subjected to illegal practices by mortgage providers. The men and women who fight bravely for our nation deserve better. We owe it to them. 15 seconds.
Gentleman.
We owe it to them. We owe it to them not to allow their families to be thrown out of their houses when they are putting their lives on the line in the name of freedom. I urge my colleagues to support our military families. Thank you, and I yield back.
The gentleman's time has expired. The gentleman from California is recognized.
Mr. Chairman, I have a colloquy on an amendment I intend to withdraw.
The gentleman from California, Mr. McKeon, is recognized. Excuse me.
Mr. Chairman, I yield to the Chairman of the Foreign Affairs Committee for the purpose of a colloquy.
The gentleman from California, Mr. Royce, is recognized.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Chairman, we are facing a serious and growing national security threat in Central Africa. Rebel groups, long active in the region, have taken on a new form of illicit activity to fill their coffers, and that form is poaching. On the black market, ivory from elephant tusks run over $1,000 per kilo. Rhino horns are worth their weight in gold, more than their weight in gold, $30,000 per pound. The black market for wildlife is now in the league of drug smuggling. The low risk and high reward of poaching makes it ideal for criminal groups, but also for extremist groups. Indeed, groups like the Lord's Resistance Army, which the U.S. military is helping Africans to track down, and the al-Qaeda-linked al-Shabaab are reaping the benefits by brutally slaughtering these majestic, defenseless animals. These aren't your poor man's poachers either. Many poachers today are outfitted with the night vision goggles and sophisticated GPS equipment. They fly helicopters. They slaughter these endangered species from above. A recent UN report cites an increase of advanced weapons used in poaching, which can be traced back to the fall of Gaddafi in Libya. Earlier this year, testifying on worldwide threats, the head of our intelligence community noted that the multi-billion-dollar industry of illicit wildlife trade threats to disrupt the rule of law in important countries around the world, and that this trade involves disparate actors, from government and military personnel to members of insurgent groups and transnational organized crime as well. Unfortunately, African nations trying to fight off transnational poachers lack the capability, lack that capacity to address the problem. With relatively few security resources dedicated to combating them, poachers operate freely. This amendment would have provided authority for the Defense Department to advise and assist Africans to suppress this illicit wildlife trade. AFRICOM is rightly involved in many of these regions, focusing on counterterrorism and on counter-narcotics. Since these illicit activities are interwoven, this is an ideal area to further our cooperation with African partners, helping their stability, our security, and the chances that the magnificent species aren't extinguished.
I yield the gentleman an additional
Time
minute.
has expired.
I thank the chairman for the additional minute. If I
the
could,
chairman's time has expired. The gentleman from Washington is recognized.
So,
Mr. Chairman, I yield a minute to Ms. Lowy from New York.
Mr. Chairman, the sexual assault epidemic plaguing our military has taken hold at the academies, which reported 80 cases of sexual assault last year, a 23% increase, and these are just the cases that were reported. My amendment would require the service academies to incorporate sexual assault prevention into their ethics curricula. Cadets and midshipmen enter academies at an impressionable age. Using ethics as an avenue to teach sexual assault prevention can strengthen the core messages of honor and respect in character development. It would also put discussion of this essential policy at the center of the service's culture, which must be changed to stop sexual assault in the military. I thank the chair and the ranking member for including my amendment in the en bloc, and I yield back. Thank you.
I reserve the balance of my time right now, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Chairman, how much time is remaining?
The gentleman from California, Mr. McKeon, has 5 minutes remaining.
On the en bloc amendments.
On the en bloc amendment.
Do we have any other requirement? Do we have any other? I yield myself such time as I may consume.
Gentleman is recognized.
I yield to the gentleman from California to finish when we were so rudely interrupted.
I thank the gentleman. Chairman McKeon, I know you share my concern with this growing transnational threat of poaching, and I am hopeful that looking ahead we can work together to address any concerns that may exist and support a more aggressive U.S. commitment to this problem.
Thank you, Chairman Royce. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I hope you appreciate my weak attempt at humor.
Indeed.
I'd like to start off first by acknowledging the long-standing work that Chairman Royce has done on this issue. The gentleman from California has spelled out the growing links between poaching and terrorist groups in Africa. I share these concerns. He's also correct that AFRICOM is continuing to engage with our African partners in a variety of ways. Under Chairman Royce's leadership, I understand that the Foreign Affairs Committee will be continuing to look into illegal wildlife trafficking in Africa and the national security consequences. I fully support that effort. I believe that we should seek a greater understanding of the linkages between these illicit activities and find an interagency approach to counter this threat. The U.S. military has a role to play in countering terrorist groups and their networks that would target our national interests in this region. So I look forward to our two committees continuing to work together.
I appreciate the Chairman's comments. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Reserve the balance of our time.
Gentleman from California reserves. The gentleman from Washington is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to yield a minute to Mr. Holt from New Jersey.
I thank the gentleman. I just wanted to describe two amendments that I have that the Chairman and the leadership were kind enough to include en bloc. I am a member of the United States Commission on Research and Development in the Intelligence Community. And I won't go through the whole report. In fact, it's being declassified in part now. But we talk about the great looming threat to our technological advantage in the intelligence arena, the shortage of scientists and engineers and mathematicians. So I have an amendment directing the Secretary of Defense to report to Congress within 60 days from this bill on whether the Science, Mathematics, and Research Transformation, or the SMART Scholarship Program, is providing adequate help to undergraduate and graduate students to meet our scientific and technical needs. I have another amendment that grew out of a suicide tragedy in my district. This amendment would allow any state adjutant general to request information for any individual ready reserve or individual mobilization augmentee living in the state, so that the adjutant general can provide suicide prevention and outreach services for such reservists. I thank the gentleman.
His time has expired. The gentleman from California is recognized.
Continue to reserve.
The gentleman from California reserves. The gentleman from Washington is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. We have no more speakers on the en bloc, and we yield back the time.
The gentleman from Washington yields back. The gentleman from California is recognized.
Continue to reserve.
The gentleman from California reserves.
The gentleman from Washington's time is yielded back.
The gentleman from Washington's time has been yielded back. So the gentleman from California is recognized.
Mr. Chairman, I yield myself the balance of my time. How much time do I have?
3 3/4 minutes. The gentleman from California has 3 3/4 minutes.
Thank you very much. Mr. Chairman, I yield myself the balance of that time. Just an hour ago, the President confirmed chemical weapons, including sarin gas, have been used by the Assad regime against Syrian civilians. The President has stated that a red line has been crossed, but I would observe that red lines are meaningless unless they are backed by action. The underlying bill reflects a sense of Congress that any red line should be backed with substantive measures. The White House stated this evening that President Obama agrees with this sentiment. Tonight, representatives of the National Security Council stated, and I quote, "The President has made the decision to support Syrian opposition. That includes military support," end quote. I expect to see more details in the coming days from the White House and the Department of Defense. I am, however, deeply concerned about our ability to honor and uphold red lines. Our military readiness and our ability to respond is degraded today. 17 combat-coded Air Force squadrons are grounded due to budget cuts. A carrier battle group should be in the Middle East, but instead is in port. We just pulled the last A-10 ground attack squadron out of Germany because some felt that a forward operating presence was unnecessary for a so-called Cold War mission. And yet we have an amendment here this evening that would cut $5 billion that, in addition to funding the troops in Afghanistan, provides support to help alleviate deep readiness problems that are porting our ships and grounding our fighter jets. Another amendment this evening would strike the very sense of Congress that all courses of action, not just military, should be considered in Syria and that our red lines must have meaning. Reality has overwhelmed both of these proposals. To my friends who think there is no risk to ever deeper cuts, I ask you to tell that to the airman and the sailor who may well face down Syrian missiles in the coming weeks. To my friends who are contemplating further cuts when they vote tomorrow, consider that you may be denying that warfighter the hour of training or the piece of hardware that means the difference between life and death. None of us is comfortable in putting them into harm's way at this time or in that place, but that does not mean that they may not have to go. And that does not mean we shouldn't give them all they need. Here, Congress and the White House agree in principle. Boundaries are useless unless they are enforced and resourced. And I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman from California yields back. The question is on the amendments en bloc as modified, offered by the gentleman from California. Those in favor say aye. Those opposed say no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The en bloc amendments are agreed to. It is now in order to consider amendment number 22, printed in Part B of House Report 113-108. For what purpose does the gentleman from New Jersey seek recognition?
I have an amendment at the desk, Mr. Chairman.
The clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment number 22, printed in Part B of House Report number 113-108, offered by Mr. Holt of New Jersey.
Pursuant to House Resolution 260, the gentleman from New Jersey, Mr. Holt, and a member opposed, each will control 5 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentleman from New Jersey.
I thank the chair, and I thank the Rules Committee and the leadership of the Armed Services Committee for making this amendment in order. The amendment's purpose is simple: to eliminate the missile defense-related portions of the bill, with the exception of the relatively successful Iron Dome program. Now, as some of you may know, I've been involved with arms control issues for decades, since I was part of the U.S. Geneva delegation, the U.S. delegation to Geneva, sent to investigate the then Soviet phased array radar at Krasnoyarsk in the early 1980s. My training as a physicist, as well as decades I've spent dealing with these issues, long ago led me to conclude a couple of things. Effective strategic ballistic missile defense systems have not been and are not likely to be technologically feasible. And second, attempting to build them only fuels the international arms race. If you don't believe this latter point, let me quote from a Russian television story on June 8th of this year. Quote, Russia's strategic missile forces have reported a successful launch of a next-generation ICBM that can supposedly pierce any anti-ballistic missile system. The test came after the U.S. announced it would resume its ABM program in Europe. That is a description of the arms race that should have ended years ago. The article goes on to quote Russian Deputy Minister Dmitry Rogozin, who says that the new Russian ICBM was, quote, a missile defense killer. Neither current nor future American missile defense systems will be able to prevent that missile from hitting the target dead on, end quote. Yes, arms race. Just as it has for over 30 years, our continued pursuit of a strategic ballistic missile defense system is perpetuating the arms race, in this case between the United States and Russia, and would perpetuate arms races between the United States and China or others. It's also an expense we cannot afford. The Missile Defense Agency itself estimates that since fiscal year 1985, Congress has appropriated $149.5 billion for strategic ballistic missile defense programs, and the system has still never been tested successfully against any of the kind of real-world threats offered by missiles equipped with decoys, jammers, and so on. This bill proposes to continue throwing good money after bad, with one exception: the tactical Iron Dome missile defense system. Our Israeli allies, with funding approved by this Congress and that I have supported and many here have supported, have developed what is arguably the best and certainly the most well-tested tactical missile defense system in the world. It's not perfect, and the missile defense experts, both here and in Israel, continue to debate the exact kill rate, which Israeli officials claim is 84%. What is clear is that this system is more practical and more immediately useful for the defense of Israel than our strategic defense system is for us. What my amendment would do is stop the United States from throwing more money at a failed, politically destabilizing strategic missile defense system, and instead would allow continuing funding for further development of efforts for Iron Dome and tactical systems like that. The kind of systems that may help save lives in Israel and save lives of deployed American troops should they face opponents like North Korea or Iran. Accordingly, I urge my colleagues to support this, and I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman reserves. For what purpose does the gentleman from California rise?
Rise to claim the time in opposition to the amendment.
The gentleman is recognized.
I yield at this time, Mr. Chairman, 3 minutes to my friend and colleague, the gentleman from Alabama, the chairman of the Strategic Forces Subcommittee, Mr. Rogers.
The gentleman from Alabama is recognized.
I thank the chairman. I thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise in vigorous opposition to Mr. Holt's amendment. At a time when the technical and strategic case for missile defense has never been stronger, the gentleman's amendment would strike bipartisan provisions that will improve our missile defenses. For example, the amendment would strike a provision the committee adopted that would improve the kill assessment capability of the ground-based mid-course defense system. Why would the gentleman want a national missile defense system with a less robust kill assessment capability than is technically possible? The amendment would strike a provision dealing with an analysis of alternatives on the future space sensor architecture for our missile defense system. Does the gentleman not want an informed judgment and study on a persistent overhead space sensor system? The gentleman may be laboring under the misimpression of missile defense so-called experts who, in the disarmament community, labor to create doubts about our missile defense deterrent system. But I ask, how many of these experts have been briefed on what the system does, on the incredibly technically demanding tests that the warfighters create? I would say none. I urge the gentleman to withdraw his amendment, come get some classified briefings. Let's see if we can can't add him to the overwhelmingly bipartisan group of policymakers that support a strong and robust national and regional missile defense. And with that, Mr. Speaker, I ask the members to vote no, and I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman yields back. The gentleman from New Jersey is recognized.
Mr. Chairman, may I ask the time remaining?
The gentleman from New Jersey has 45 seconds remaining.
Fine. I thank the chair, and I will just quickly say then that the desire for a strategic missile defense system may be as strong as it ever has been, but the demonstration, the accomplishments of the work towards such a system are no farther along than they have been for decades. You cannot. We can repeal legislation. We could repeal perhaps Obamacare if the other side had their way, but we cannot repeal the laws of physics. And long experience with this tells me this is a wasteful program. The Iron Dome tactical system and systems like that, on the other hand, are worth pursuing, and I propose keeping that funding intact. I yield back my time. Thank you.
Gentleman's time has expired. The gentleman from California is recognized. He has 3.5 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, I yield 2 minutes to my friend and colleague, the gentleman from Colorado, Mr. Lamborn. You said we had 3.5 minutes? I'll yield him the balance of the time.
The gentleman from Colorado is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I thank the chairman of the full committee, and I also appreciate what the chairman of the subcommittee, Mr. Rogers of Alabama, has said. I totally agree with what he has already put forward. And against this amendment, I would have to add that one of the other things it does harmful to our national defense is it would stop the progress we're making on creating a third site in the eastern coast of the United States for missile defense. He quoted some Russian television commentator. That has no relevance to what ground-based missile defense is all about. Ground-based missile defense is against a rogue missile fired from a North Korea or Iran or some country like that, or an accidental single launch from another country. It is not to fight against the Russians or the Chinese. That's not it at all. So we have some interceptors already in place in Alaska and in California. The eastern site would add that same capability of defense against a rogue missile on the East Coast. I happen to believe that we should be protecting the East Coast better than we are today. I think the people of New Jersey, let's say, deserve just as much protection as the people of California. And we have that capability. You said it hasn't defeated jammers and decoys. The North Koreans don't have jammers and decoys. The Iranians aren't even that far along. They're not as far along as the North Koreans. So we don't have to have the perfect. In this case, the perfect would be the enemy of the good. We have had missiles in tests that, like a bullet shooting down a bullet. We have had many successful tests, and we could stop a North Korean or Iranian missile. And we have that on the West Coast. We should have that on the East Coast. This Congress, in the last year's NDAA, put in language calling for an environmental assessment and study of the East Coast site. That should go forward. And unfortunately, this amendment, should it pass, would stop this progress in its tracks. So for that and the reasons already stated by Representative Rogers, I would urge a strong no. This would be destructive of missile defense. This would be destructive of our national defense. Please vote no. Mr. Chairman, I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back.
Mr. Chairman, you yield back the balance of our time.
Gentleman yields back. The question is on the amendment offered by the gentleman from New Jersey. Those in favor say aye. Those opposed say no. In the opinion of the chair, the noes have it. The amendment is not agreed to. The gentleman from New Jersey.
I ask a recorded vote.
Pursuant to Clause 6 of Rule 18, further proceedings on the amendment offered by the gentleman from New Jersey will be postponed. It is now in order to consider Amendment Number 25, printed in Part B of House Report 113-108. For what purpose does the gentlewoman from Minnesota seek recognition?
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment number 25, printed in Part B of House Report number 113-108, offered by Ms. McCollum of Minnesota.
Pursuant to House Resolution 260, the gentlewoman from Minnesota, Ms. McCollum, and a member opposed, each will control 5 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentlewoman from Minnesota.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The National Guard is spending over $35 million in taxpayers' funds this year to sponsor World Wrestling Entertainment and motorsports wrestling. That's right. In a time of enormous federal budget deficits, endless borrowing from China, sequestration, harming military readiness, and deep cuts to the services for vulnerable children, seniors, and people with disabilities, the Army National Guard is spending $53,586,000, $53 million. Over that, to have its logo highlighted at the World Wrestling events, to sponsor NASCAR racing and Indy car racing. After years of congressional debate, the Army National Guards can still not provide any statistics, 0 statistics, to demonstrate anyone has signed a recruiting contract as a result of this program. This amendment can bring both liberals and Tea Party conservatives together. The fact that $53 million in taxpayers' funds is going to sponsor some of the most violent and sexist entertainment on television, and NASCAR racing teams that results in 0 recruits is a waste of money, and it should be stopped. As a member of the Defense Appropriations Subcommittee, over and over the past 3 months, our subcommittee has heard from military leaders that sequestration is causing a crisis. Military readiness is diminished. Hundreds of thousands of critical civilian Pentagon employees are being furloughed, and vital services like access to mental health care is being cut. In fact, the National Guard testified that because of sequestration, 115,000 traditional National Guard forces will not receive their annual medical or dental examinations. The Guard says, and I quote, "This reduction in examinations will bring a total force medical readiness down by 39%. Yet the National Guard can afford to pay one NASCAR race driver $29 million and pay another driver $14 million for IndyCar racing. Clearly, this is a case of misplaced priorities. Congress has to make tough choices and smart cuts. Terminating this wasteful, effective program is an easy choice, unless you want to protect government handouts to millionaire race car drivers and owners. In the past, some of my conservative friends have made the claim that cutting this wasteful spending was micromanaging the Pentagon. My job is not to protect race car track owners and millionaire race car drivers. Cutting government waste and protecting taxpayers' dollars is not micromanaging. It is our job. In recent years, the Army, Navy, and Marine Corps have all terminated NASCAR sponsorships because these sponsorships fail to meet their recruiting goals. They're making other, more effective investments in recruiting dollars. The Army is sponsoring high school football, the All-American Bowl. That's fantastic. They're also sponsoring robotic competitions to engage with help with our young people in developing the skills to best serve our nation and to serve in the armed forces. The very best marketing that our Army National Guard gets is not from a logo on a race car or a violent wrestling performance. It is from the life-saving work that our National Guardsmen and women do in performing during times of crisis in our communities, during the floods, during the forest fires, and during national disasters. I am so proud of the service and sacrifice of the Minnesota National Guardsmen and women who have served our nation in Kosovo, Iraq, and Afghanistan, and at home in Minnesota over the past decade. They are heroes. The opponents of my amendment believe that a $29 million taxpayer-funded logo on a race car results in the National Guard recruits and reenlistment. Based on what? The National Guard has failed to prove any data, no program measures that this program has resulted in any recruits. Zero data, zero recruits. This Republican Congress is cutting children off of school lunch programs, kicking them off of Head Start to save money. This Congress is willing to inflict sequestration on our military, and it undermines our readiness. This amendment gives members an opportunity to cut real waste. And, Mr. Chair, I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentlelady reserves. For what purpose does the gentleman from Texas rise?
Mr. Chairman, I claim the time in opposition.
The gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield 2 minutes to the distinguished gentleman from North Carolina, Mr. Hudson.
The gentleman from North Carolina, Mr. Hudson, is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I rise amongst a broad bipartisan coalition to oppose this misguided amendment offered by my colleague from Minnesota. Mr. Chairman, facts are a stubborn thing. The National Guard has reiterated time and time again the immense value of their recruiting and retention programs in professional motorsports. The facts of this program show a successful return on investment for the taxpayers. To demonstrate the success of this program, I'd like to cite 3 crystal clear numbers which support strong opposition to this amendment. First, 90%. In the June 4th letter to House Appropriations, the National Guard Association of the United States and their counterpart, the Enlisted Association of the National Guard, stated that a recent independent study found that 90% of the Army National Guard soldiers who enlisted or re-enlisted were exposed to the Guard from recruiting or retention materials featuring NASCAR drivers and their cars. 90%. That's a real return on your investment, a return on the investment of the American people. Second number is 85%. Of those who enlisted or re-enlisted during that time period, 85% agree that professional sports are beneficial to attracting and retaining good soldiers. That's, again, a good return on your investment. And the last number is 400,000. Since embarking on a more robust use of professional sports sponsorships in fiscal year 2007, the Army National Guard has added more than 400,000 new soldiers. That, Mr. Chairman, is a return on your investment. Mr. Chairman, these facts come from sound research and an independent study which the National Guard has shared with us, and by unanimous consent, I'd like to enter into the record here with my remarks today.
Without objection.
I submit these facts to my colleagues and encourage them to consider the tremendous return on investment we would be stealing from our nation's military and hardworking taxpayers if this amendment were to pass. I urge my colleagues to vote no.
Would the
Mr.
gentleman
Chairman, I
yield?
yield back.
The gentleman yields back. The gentleman's request will be covered by general leave. The general lady from Minnesota is recognized for 30 seconds.
The Army decided to end its 10-year NASCAR sponsorship, calling it not good investment because 5% of NASCAR viewers weren't even the age for recruitment. Let's end this wasteful program. Let's put the money to work to recruit and keep a strong military. With that, I yield back, and I ask for a vote from the members to support my amendment.
The gentlelady yields back. The gentleman from Texas is recognized.
Mr. Chairman, I yield 1 minute to the distinguished gentlelady from North Carolina, Ms. Fox.
Mr. Chairman, I thank the gentleman for yielding and for his leadership on this issue. NASCAR is a vital part of the National Guard's outreach to young Americans. NASCAR fans between the age of 18 and 34 are twice as likely as their peers to consider the military. Their fellow fans are more likely to support their friends and family members choosing the military as a career option. Advertising through NASCAR gives the military a cost-effective way to reach 75 million patriotic fans. That's why it is reported a 3-to-1 return on the program's investment. NASCAR's support of the military goes beyond mere sponsorship opportunities. NASCAR holds swearing-in ceremonies for hundreds of new recruits each year, giving the fans a real-life example of the patriotism they support. NASCAR is a real part of hundreds of American communities. The National Guard has chosen to use its limited recruiting budget through the means it feels are most effective. We should not force it to turn its back on a proven means of leveraging that budget and introducing millions of potential heroes to their opportunity to serve. I urge my fellow members to oppose this amendment. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for the opportunity to speak, and I yield back.
The gentlelady yields back. The gentleman from Texas is recognized.
Mr. Chairman, I yield 1 minute to the distinguished gentleman from New York, Mr. Collins.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This amendment wrongly targets one of our best recruiting practices of the National Guard. Motorsport sponsorship programs have helped the Guard add 400,000 new citizen soldiers since it was begun in 2007, many of whom were sworn in right at the track. Why would we want to cut something that's working? Every season, the National Guard emblem is seen by millions on the hood of Dale Earnhardt Jr.'s car, one of the most popular drivers during the last 10 years. Since the National Guard is prohibited from advertising on broadcast television, motorsport sponsorships are one of the few ways the Guard can market to a national audience while still interacting with local communities. This amendment takes a strong program proven valuable to our military readiness and arbitrarily cuts it for the sake of political posturing. This amendment does not save any money. It does not address any government excess or impropriety. It unnecessarily attacks our National Guard, and it shackles their best opportunity to recruit and retain the very best for national security. As in the previous 2 Defense Authorization Acts, I urge members to hold strong and continue to oppose this amendment. I yield back.
Gentleman's time has expired. Gentleman from Texas.
Mr. Chairman, I yield 1 minute to the distinguished Subcommittee Chairman, Strategic Forces Subcommittee, Mr. Rogers of Alabama.
The gentleman from Alabama is recognized.
I thank the Chairman and I thank the Speaker. I rise in strong opposition to the McCollum Amendment. The McCollum Amendment would prohibit the Army National Guard from sponsoring and advertising in professional motorsports. This amendment would have a negative impact on the recruiting of soldiers to enlist or re-enlist in the National Guard. Recent studies have shown that around 90% of the Army National Guard soldiers who enlisted or re-enlisted since 2007 were exposed to this form of advertising. Additionally, these creative advertising techniques reach a sport with over 75 million loyal viewers, many of which are between the age of 18 and 34 years old, the target audience to recruit quality soldiers for the Army National Guard. I fully recognize the need for Congress to cut unnecessary spending, and I have voted many times to rein in government spending. However, I see no need to prohibit this successful form of advertising which works to recruit quality men and women to help protect and defend our nation. I urge a no vote on the McCollum Amendment number 21, and with that I yield back.
Gentleman's time has expired. Gentleman from Texas is recognized, has 1 minute. I'm sorry, the gentleman from Texas, the time has expired. All time has expired. The question is on the amendment offered by the gentlewoman from Minnesota. Those in favor say aye. Those opposed say no. In the opinion of the chair, the noes have it, and the amendment is not agreed to.
Mr. Chairman, on that vote, I request a recorded vote.
The gentlelady from Minnesota requests a recorded vote. Pursuant to Clause 6 of Rule 18, further proceedings on the amendment offered by the gentlelady from Minnesota will be postponed.
You read that first.
What's this? You want to read this?
Offered. Yeah.
The chair understands that the amendment number 28 will not be offered. It is now in order to consider amendment number 32, printed in Part B of House Report 113-108. For what purpose does the gentleman from Minnesota seek recognition?
Mr. Speaker, I move to amend.
The clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment number 32, printed in Part B of House Report number 113-108, offered by Mr. Nolan of Minnesota.
Pursuant to House Resolution 260, the gentleman from Minnesota, Mr. Nolan, and a member opposed, each will control 5 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Minnesota.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I yield myself such time as I may consume. Mr. Speaker, I rise today on a matter of the highest priority, critical to the future of our great nation and our people. It is time to put an end to the wars of choice in the nation building abroad and to start rebuilding America. Daily, we are reminded of our nation's fiscal crises, massive deficits and unemployment, shortage of revenues for the things we know we need to do. The simple truth is, the trillions of dollars spent on the wars of choice and the nation building abroad are the primary cause of our current financial crises, not Social Security and Medicare, as some would have us believe. The sad fact is, our own bridges are falling down, our infrastructure is crumbling, and our education system is struggling, while millions more middle-class men and women are unemployed or underemployed. Mr. Speaker, I strongly support a strong national defense, but I also agree completely with my Republican colleague, Congressman Mo Brooks of Alabama, who recently said, and I quote, "I don't believe that America can financially afford to be the police cop on every street corner in the world. We no longer have the financial resources to do that." In fact, the $652 billion we spent on the military last year amounts to 57% of our discretionary budget. Mind you, education is at 6%, agriculture at 1%, transportation at 2%. Moreover, that $652 billion spent last year accounts for more than the next 10 largest military budgets in the world combined. China, Russia, UK, Japan, France, Saudi, India, Germany, Italy, Brazil. We spend more than all of them combined. This $60 billion cut that is proposed in this amendment, or a 9.4% cut that I propose, is not an unreasonable amount. In fact, it is exactly the same amount the Commission on Wartime Contracting estimates to have been wasted through fraud and abuse in Iraq and Afghanistan. Understand that my amendment is not an across-the-board cut from every line item, as in sequestration, which makes no sense at all. My proposed cut is a cut from the bottom line that would give the Appropriations Committee the authority to decide where the cuts can most prudently be made. And to me, those categories are crystal clear. We want to cut our excessive network of military bases in every nook and cranny of the world. We need to cut the failed infrastructure and investments in nation building abroad. We need to cut assistance to the armed combatants in every sectional and civil war in the world. We need to cut discretionary funds to initiate new programs not authorized by the Congress. We need to cut funds for the extravagant compensation of CEOs in the giant defense contractors. We need to cut military weapon systems that were not requested by our military. We need to cut funds maintaining the unnecessary facilities in Guantanamo, and we need to cut funding maintaining out-of-date weapon systems and naval vessels. Now, let me be clear where we must not cut. We must not cut veterans' benefits. We must not cut the National Guard. That's our most efficient bang for the dollar that we get in our national defense. We must not cut compensation to soldiers and their families. We must not cut assistance to Israel and our other strategic allies. We should not cut funds to the teams and other elite units that can respond to crises abroad. And we cannot cut efforts to fund reform of military justice and reduce sexual assaults in the military. Moreover, it is my recommendations that the savings achieved here can be used for deficit reduction and used for investment in our own infrastructure, our roads, our bridges, our ports, our education, and the unmet human development needs in this country. We can use this money to improve the quality of American lives, to stimulate our economy, to strengthen our power as a nation, and to help restore America's confidence in the future. Finally, Mr. Speaker, my amendment is entirely consistent with the spirit of the Bipartisan Budget Control Act of 2011, which recommended $1 trillion in defense cuts over the next decade, and consistent as well with the significant cuts recommended across the spectrum by liberal policy groups such as the Center for American Progress, as well as conservative and liberal groups. Mr. Speaker, we all support a strong national defense. We support our troops, and we are committed to our veterans. This amendment is not politics. It's common sense economics.
For what purpose does the gentleman from Texas rise?
Mr. Chairman, I claim the time in opposition.
Gentleman is recognized.
Mr. Chairman, I yield myself 2 minutes.
Gentleman is recognized.
Mr. Chairman, in some ways I admire the gentleman from Minnesota because he states clearly what he believes. In my opinion, his argument, however, is dangerous, and it will mean a very much more dangerous world for the United States and many of the people around the world who depend upon us. If we're going to talk numbers, we ought to just remind everybody that in 1960, the defense budget was about half of the total budget of the United States government. Today, it's 17% of the budget for the United States government. Now, it's true, it's most of the discretionary spending, but that completely leaves out the entitlements or the mandatory spending program, which are a vast majority of the government. So in more recent history, let's think about defense already took a reduction of $487 billion over a 10-year period. In the current fiscal year, it was cut another $55 billion. And now this amendment would take another $60 billion on top of that. Mr. Chairman, I think defense has been cut enough. If anyone had been listening to some of the debates we've been having today, you would hear about readiness being down, about training not occurring, about more expensive procurements because we can't buy at the most efficient rate. And this amendment would take another $60 billion on top of the other things and would include, of course, the personnel counts, which were exempt under sequestration. But the ironic thing, Mr. Chairman, is that after you take this $60 billion out of defense, it would get hit again once sequestration cuts in. So, in effect, this doubles the cuts that come on defense from sequestration. It is mistaken. It is tragically mistaken, and I think it should be rejected.
This time has expired.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, at this point I would yield 1 minute to the distinguished gentleman from Alabama, Mr. Rogers.
The gentleman from Alabama is recognized for 1 minute.
I thank the chairman and I thank the speaker. You know, I never cease to be amazed in this chamber. The only time I see my colleagues on the other side of the aisle concerned about fiscal restraint and cutting spending is when it comes to national defense. You know, One of the most knuckleheaded things this Congress has done is the sequestration framework that I unfortunately was a part of setting into place. But, as you just heard my colleague from Texas State, we had already cut $480 billion out of defense before sequestration comes into play. Now we have sequestration coming into play. The thought that we could be in a war, defend against potential areas of war that are emerging around the world with further cuts is mindless and irresponsible. We owe it to the men and women in this country who serve in uniform and their families to make sure they have everything they need to be safe and successful when we send them into a theater of war. This amendment is dangerous, and I urge my colleagues to reject it.
Gentleman's time has expired. The gentleman from Texas is recognized.
I yield myself the balance of the time. I appreciate my colleague from Alabama, and I would just conclude with 2 points. One is that it is in the Constitution where it clearly provides that a primary, and I believe the primary responsibility of the federal government is to defend the country. You can't do that on the cheap. Obviously, you ought to be efficient. You shouldn't waste money. But the first job of the federal government is to defend the country. Second point I want to make is this. There are some people who seem to want to stick their head in the sand and believe that all the threats have gone away. As a matter of fact, the President seemed to say a few weeks ago in his speech that the war on terrorism was over. And then today, the President acknowledges that there is evidence that is clear, at least in his mind, that chemical weapons have been used in Syria. So whether you think about al-Qaeda and its affiliates spreading out all over the world, or whether you think about the very real dangers of chemical weapons in Syria, not just being used against Syrians, but potentially getting in the hands of terrorists and being used against us, or whether you think about the new domain of warfare, which is cybersecurity, or warfare in space, whether you think about the potential military rise of China and what that means for the United States and its interest, as you just wrap your mind around the headlines and the news of the world, my point is the threats have not gone away. This is a dangerous world. Only the United States is a superpower to maintain stability and to protect the lives and freedoms of Americans. That takes some resources. We've already cut defense. We've already cut defense enough. And certainly we should not cut defense again. This amendment, as I say, Mr. Chairman, is dangerous. It should be rejected, and I yield back.
The gentleman from Texas yields back. The question is on the amendment offered by the gentleman from Minnesota. Those in favor say aye. Aye. Those opposed say no. No. In the opinion of the chair, the noes
Mr. Speaker,
gentleman from Minnesota?
Request a recorded vote.
Gentleman from Minnesota requests a recorded vote. Pursuant to Clause 6, Rule 18, further proceedings on the amendment offered by the gentleman from Minnesota will be postponed. For what purpose does the gentleman from Texas seek recognition?
Mr. Chairman, as designee of the chairman and pursuant to H-Res 260, I offer amendments en bloc.
The clerk will designate the amendments en bloc.
On block number 4, consisting of amendments numbered 64, 67, 69, 70, 72, 74, 77, 78, 79, 82, 83, 102, 107, and 126, printed in House Report number 113-108, offered by Mr. Thornberry of Texas.
Pursuant to House Resolution 260, the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Thornberry, and the gentleman from Washington, Mr. Larson, each will control 10 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Texas.
Mr. Chairman, I urge the committee to adopt the amendments en bloc, all of which have been examined by both the majority and the minority. And with that, I would reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman reserves. The gentleman from Washington.
Mr. Chairman, I rise in support of the en bloc amendment and encourage people to encourage our colleagues to support it, and with that, reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back the balance of his time.
I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman reserves the balance of his time. The gentleman from Texas.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, I yield 1 minute to the gentleman from Florida, Mr. Posey.
The gentleman from Florida is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I thank the gentleman for yielding. I'm pleased that my bipartisan bill, the Deployed Troops Support Act, is part of an en bloc amendment later this evening. My amendment simply allows the Department of Defense to transport on a space-available basis goods supplied by nonprofit organizations to members of the armed services who are deployed overseas. We ensure that the Secretary has the authority to determine that there is a legitimate need for the goods being shipped and that the supplies are suitable for distribution, and that adequate arrangements have been made for the distribution when the shipment arrives. This legislative idea was brought to me by veterans in my congressional district, specifically AVET project. If enacted into law, it would give our troops the same consideration on a space-available basis as currently granted to foreigners under the Denton program. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. The gentleman from Washington.
Mr. Chairman, I yield 2 minutes to Ms. Esty from Connecticut.
The gentlelady from Connecticut is recognized for 2 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I rise in support of this en bloc amendment, which includes my amendment to add the proper replacement of metals and performance tracking, the PROMPT Act, to the underlying legislation. I want to first thank Chairman McKeon and Ranking Member Smith for their leadership and cooperation. And I'd also like to thank my colleague, Dr. Joe Heck,